Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the Renaissance of Iranian civilization. With me is Jason Reza Jorjani, author of several books, including Prometheus and Atlas, World State of Emergency, Lovers of Sophia, novel Folklore, and Iranian Leviathan. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with you, Jeffrey.
Likewise, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm delighted that you've made yourself available here in Albuquerque as well. When we think of Iran, most people would say, well, it's a country. You're suggesting it's much more than just a nation, even much more than an ancient nation. It represents a civilization. So I guess it would be useful to begin by defining what you mean by civilization.
Yeah, so Iran is not like Spain or France or Italy. Iran is like the whole of Western civilization. So the way I look at the distinction between culture and civilization, or between a particular country and the civilization that it's part of, is that a civilization includes a number of different cultures, usually with linguistic differentiation as one of the factors that define the distinctions between these cultures. So, for example, in Western civilization, we have all of the various languages that descended from Latin, Italian, French, Spanish. And so the disintegration of the Roman Empire led to local cultural differentiation that produced the Italian, the French, the Spanish cultures. Within Western civilization, we also have other branches of the European languages, like the Germanic branch. So, you have a variety of distinct cultures in Europe, which as early as the pagan Roman Empire were integrated into a single civilization. As early as the period of pagan Rome, you had the Romans in Germania, and Germany was being integrated into the Roman Empire. Even the Celtic regions of Gaul, or what's today France, were being integrated into a single civilizational sphere with Rome. So Iran is analogous to that. Iran is a civilization that includes a variety of, from antiquity included, a variety of distinct cultures that overlap and interpenetrate in various ways, and that are descended from a common ancestry. So these in ancient times included the Persians, the Medes, the Scythians, and the Sarmatians, at least four distinct branches of Iranian civilization. And these various Iranians all spoke different languages, although they were closely related, like the various Latinate languages are related. And they had different cultures, although their cultures deeply influenced one another. So, for example, some people are inclined to see Zarathustra as the founder of Iranian civilization. Matter of fact, I've made that claim myself in the past. But if you look closely at Zarathustra's life and times, you will see that this man was expounding his message. He was bringing his philosophical revolution into the milieu of the Median kingdom at its zenith, when the culture of the Medes was pressing up against Scythian Central Asia. And the Median kingdom entered into war with the Scythians. So, you had a cultural conflict ultimately between the rising Zoroastrian faith, the new revolutionary religious vision of Zarathustra, and the older Mithraic shamanistic religion of the Scythians. And then, later on in Iranian history, after the fall of the first Persian Empire to the Greeks and the Hellenistic colonization of Iran, it's the Scythians who come down in the form of the Parthian Dynasty. The Scythians come down and they reestablish an Iranian empire after the hiatus of the Hellenistic conquest of Iran. So the Parthian Dynasty is of ethnic Scythian origin. And we've had other dynasties throughout the course of Iranian history, like, for example, the Safavids, that were of a ethno-linguistic extraction that's other than Persian. For example, Shah Ismail Safavi was a Kurd. So the Persians have been the ethnic and linguistic core of Iranian civilization throughout most of its history. The Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin has a concept that I came across when I was editing one of his books back in the days when I was the editor-in-chief of Arctos. I came across the concept of narod in his work, in Dugin's work. The idea of the ethnic and linguistic pith of a civilization.
Is that a Russian word?
Yes, it's the ethnic or linguistic pith of a civilization around which all of the other internal differentiations of the civilization sort of hang. And he characterizes, for example, the Russian language and culture as the pith of Eurasian civilization. And in the case of Iranian civilization, the Persian language and culture are play the role of the core of Iranian civilization, and have done so for 2,500 years. But the Medes, the first Iranian kingdom, were not Persians. And then, as I suggested, the Scythians played an important role in revitalizing Iranian civilization after the Hellenistic conquest. And we had another branch of Iranian civilization, the Sarmatians, who, as they were called in Europe, the Alans, migrated all the way to Spain and were transplanted by Marcus Aurelius to the British Isles and deeply impacted the development of Western civilization, particularly by transplanting the chivalric culture and Grail mysticism of Iran, what we call Javan Mardi or Farhang Pahlavani. They transplanted this Iranian tradition into late Roman and medieval Europe. So that's a whole other branch of Iranian civilization that extended from the northwest into Europe.
So you're suggesting that the Iranian civilization involves, in turn, various branches of the civilization achieving prominence. The Persians at one time, the Scythians at another time. So there's a fusion of these local cultures, much in the way, I suppose, Western civilization is the fusion of Latin and Germanic cultures. But that at its core is the Persian language.
Yes, and if you want to draw another analogy, you could draw an analogy to China, where you have the Han core of the civilization, and various other cultures like the Manchurian, Mongolian, Tibetan cultures that have been part of one or another Chinese empire throughout the course of history and have come to form part of the Chinese civilizational sphere. And so, for example, you have the Cantonese, southern part of China, and a variety of languages that are Chinese and form part of the fabric of Chinese civilization. But, the Han ethnicity and the Mandarin language are the pith of that civilization.
Well, I know at one point you told me that there was a time at which Persian was the official court language, ranging all the way from India to Turkey.
Yeah, so it's not as if these various branches of Iranian civilization were limited to antiquity, to the pre-Islamic period. Iran continued to be a civilization rather than a mere culture or nation all the way into the modern period. So, the Mughal dynasty that was established in northern India, actually from an offshoot of people from Iranian Central Asia. Babur came down from the area around Samarkand and established the Mughal dynasty. The Mughal dynasty in northern India adopted Persian as its administrative and literary language, and the prominence of Persian in India was such that all of the major works of Indian literature, like the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the Bhagavad Gita, were translated into Persian and read more widely in Persian than in their Sanskrit originals. And then, for example, the poetry of Hafez was so widely disseminated in India that there were more commentaries on Hafez produced in India than in Iran itself.
Hafez being a great Persian poet.
Well, I mean, you could say, the greatest Persian poet. Some people have described Hafez as the epitome of the collective unconscious of the Iranian nation. So there were more commentaries on Hafez produced in India than in Iran itself, and the first printed editions of Hafez that were read by Europeans like Goethe and Nietzsche, and ultimately Americans like Emerson. The first printed editions of Hafez were produced in Calcutta and made it to Europe from India. In fact, there was such a prominence of Persian literature in northern India under the Mughals that entire period of Persian poetry stylistically is referred to in Iran as Sabk-e Hindi, or the Indian style. Mm-hmm. So, and then, the Taj Mahal, which is probably the most emblematic Indian building, was designed by an Iranian architect. The architecture and the art of the Mughal court were also Persianate. And then, as you mentioned, the Ottomans in Anatolia, also used Persian as their administrative and their literary language. And as early as 1400, the daughter of one of the leaders of the Molavi Sufi order established by Rumi married Sultan Bayezid of the Ottoman Empire and created a kind of alliance between the Sufi spiritual tradition of Rumi, the Persian Sufi spiritual tradition of Rumi, and the Ottoman court. So there was a Persianate culture in the Ottoman Empire as well. And what this means is that we have a Persianate world all the way from Delhi in India, actually all the way from Bengal, the Bay of Bengal in India, to the Bosphorus, to Istanbul in Anatolia.
We're talking about what at one time was a empire that ruled over half of the world's population.
Well, the Achaemenid Empire ruled literally over almost half of the world's population. And then in this period we were just discussing, let's say, 1500s through the 1700s, again, you had a vast Persianate world. And it's important to note that this Persianate world could have been politically unified as well. Nadir Shah Afshar, a general from the Afshar tribe who was serving in the Safavid military during the collapse of the Safavid Empire to a revolt of Afghans in one of the eastern provinces of Iran, who seized the capital of the Safavid Empire and were responsible for the collapse of the Safavid state. During that period, this general, Nadir Gholi Khan, of the Afshar tribe, basically took it upon himself to restore the Safavid state, but then ultimately crowned himself as the Shah of Iran. And he was a brilliant military tactician. Some have compared him to Peter the Great of Russia, some to Napoleon Bonaparte. He not only reunified Iran, he ultimately expanded the borders of Iran down to Delhi in India, and colonized northern India. So, and then he began to wage a series of campaigns against the Ottomans in the West, which resulted in the recapture of Iraq, which had been part of Iran throughout all of the ancient Persian empires, had been actually the capital district of Iran, and he kept pushing to the West. And so Nadir could have reunified this, he could have reunified something on the scale of the Achaemenid Empire as a sphere of Iranian civilization, politically reunified it. And to that end, one of the things he did was disestablish Shi'ism. The Safavids had established Shi'ism as the state religion of Iran. But, the Persianate culture of northern India was nominally Sunni, and so was the Ottoman Caliphate. So by disestablishing Shi'ism, albeit for the brief period that he ruled, Nadir was hoping to be able to rival the Caliphate, or rather to supplant the Ottoman Caliphate, as the protector of the Islamic world, as the vice-regent of God on earth. And I think that had a good chance of happening. The problem is that the cultural and spiritual backbone to sustain such an imperial project at that time had not materialized. And it does eventually materialize about a century later. Nadir's in the 1740s. In the 1850s, you have the rise of the Babi movement and the Baha'i faith, where you have this radical Shiite theological school, the Sheikhi school, produce a leader, Sayyid Ali Muhammad of Shiraz, who claims to be the hidden imam. And he advocates in his Bayan, in his text called the Bayan, and a number of other writings, he advocates a series of progressive reforms to the Shiite Muslim faith that aim very much in the same way as Mani to create a one-world religion. Mm-hmm. And although he is martyred in 1850 by the Qajar government, his successor, Baha'u'llah, who is exiled into the Ottoman Empire, continues this mission, and actually has a vision for the creation of a League of United Nations, which he sees as an alliance of colonial monarchies headed by a kind of king of kings. And he wrote to the Shah of Iran at the time, suggesting that, Iran was the cradle of the cause of God, and that Iran should assume the responsibility of creating this League of United Nations and unifying the world under a single humanistic religion. Just so that no one has any confusion, I'm not a Baha'i, nor am I advocating the institutionalization of Baha'ism in today's Iran. But my point is a historical and cultural one. Had something like the Baha'i faith manifested at the time when Nadir Shah Afshar, who was clearly open-minded in terms of religion, was attempting to create this vast imperial sphere from Delhi to Istanbul, if Nadir had endorsed something like the Baha'i faith and attempted to institutionalize it as the state religion, I think that all of these progressive reforms, like the equality of women that were being advocated by the Bab and by Baha'u'llah, the equality of women and, parliamentary government and so on and so forth, I think that, improvements to the education system, these kinds of reforms, the abolition of the hijab, the first people to advocate for the abolition of the hijab were the followers of the Bab, particularly a woman by the name, her epithet was Qurratul Ain, solace of the eyes, during the period when the Bab was imprisoned and awaiting his death sentence. She proposed and carried out the first removal of the veil. So these modernizing progressive policies appeared in Iran for the first time as part of this religious revolution of the Babis and the Baha'is. And if this had happened during the reign of Nadir Shah about a century earlier, I think you would have had the cultural and spiritual backbone for the formation of an Iranian global colonial power that could rival the rising European colonial powers of the time.
Now, in the course of your visit here, we've done a number of interviews about Iranian history, and I see from time to time, and in several of the different dynasties, there seemed to be the ambition to craft an ethos, I think is the word you might use, an ethos or a religion that could become a global religion for a world empire, either through Judaism or through Manichaeism or through Shia Islam. So this ambition has been around going actually back to the most ancient times in Iran.
That's right. I don't think we can say that all civilizations have a vision of world order. Mm-hmm. Western civilization certainly does. I'm not sure the Chinese civilization does. Western civilization certainly does, and Iranian civilization does as well. I mean, the project of creating a unified world order for the betterment of humanity, rather than any particular ethnicity or culture, is a vision that goes all the way back to the Achaemenids. And it resurfaces repeatedly in the course of Iranian history, including, as you mentioned, in the period when Shapur the Great, the Sassanid Emperor Shapur the Great, becomes the patron of Mani. And I think you also see this ambition, in a way, in the humanism of the first Iranian Renaissance. You see this kind of humanistic, universalistic view in the thinkers of the period 850 to about 1050 or 1100 in Iran, where, local Iranian fiefdoms have broken the stranglehold of the Arabian Caliphate over Iran, and you have dynasties like the Buyids based around present-day Tehran, what was then the city of Ray, and the Samanids, based around Samarkand, becoming the patrons of scientists, free thinkers, and artists and literary figures, and producing a flourishing of science and culture that I think has been mistakenly defined as a golden age of Islam. The majority of these scientists and literary figures and so forth were Persians. I mean, at least 90% of them were. So, this is a period where we see Khwarazmi, or Algorithmi as he's called in the West. We get the word algorithm from his name. Khwarazmi invents algebra. He also is responsible for the development of the first astronomical tables that are based on new discoveries and aren't just a reiteration of what was achieved by the Greeks. You have Razi from the city of Ray, which is currently Tehran. You have Razi, who is the inventor of ophthalmology and pediatrics as distinct fields of medicine, and the person who discovered the uses of kerosene and alcohol. A man who, by the way, really highlights the fallacy of defining this milieu of science and learning as Islamic, because in a book called something like the Fraud or Trickery of the Prophets, he heaps scorn on the Quran repeatedly and just basically mocks people who believe in religious revelation. He was a great rationalist and skeptic, a resurrector of the atomic theory, and someone who critiqued scholasticism based on the theory of the four humors of Galen or the four elements of Aristotle. He basically, subjected that to a really devastating critique and attempted to bring back the atomic theory. Omar Khayyam, is a harsh critic again of Islam and was the greatest astronomer and mathematician of his time. Ibn Sina, whose medical works, his Qanun fil Tibb, was still being used in the early modern period in Europe. Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he's known in the West, at the end of his life confessed that he was intimidated by Islamic orthodoxy into not expressing his true opinions until the end of his life. So these people were really doing this breakthrough work as free thinkers, not as Muslim thinkers. And, some of them, by the way, are identified with the qualifier al-Majusi. So, for example, Khwarazmi, after his name, you see al-Majusi in a lot of records of the period, and that means the Magian. So some of these Iranians were being identified as having been ancestrally Zoroastrian. But I think what has happened to produce this flourishing of science and culture is that these people who were part of a kind of highly integrated, internally cohesive Zoroastrian culture in the Sasanian period were all of a sudden freed from any kind of state orthodoxy. They didn't take Islam, the religion of the caliphate, very seriously. And so they were basically at liberty to pursue their research as Persian freethinkers. And while it is the case that because of the dominance of the caliphate, they had to pen lots of their works in Arabic, if the Buyid dynasty had continued to flourish, it had, after all, captured Baghdad and for a while reduced the caliphate to being its vassal. Eventually, they would have had Persian patrons that allowed them to pen these scientific treatises in Persian. And, unfortunately, the invasion of the Turks around 1050 stopped that from happening. But the fact that in the same period, in this Iranian Renaissance, we see a revival of the Persian language by Ferdowsi, by Abul Qasim Ferdowsi, from Tus, near present-day Mashhad. The fact that we see a revival of the Persian language in the project of the composing of the Shahnameh, commissioned by the Samanids, one of these local dynasties, the production of other romantic masterpieces like Veys and Ramin by Fakhruddin Gorgani, attests to the fact that the resurrection of the Persian language would eventually have been reflected in scientific works of the time as well.
Mm-hmm. I think most people, and probably like myself, when we think of the term civilization in that part of the world, we think of it as an Islamic civilization.
Right. And I think that's a deep misunderstanding. This flourishing of science and culture happened because of Islam, but not in a positive sense. It happened because Islam shattered a society in which the intellectual elite were thinking within a pre-established orthodox religious paradigm. So Zoroastrianism has very rationalistic elements to it. It is in a way a philosophical theology. And the fact that it was institutionalized as a state orthodoxy by the Sassanids, after all, Khosrow I, massacred 100,000 Mazdakites in order to really reinforce the institutionalization of Zoroastrianism in the late Sassanid period. And he had thinkers like Bozorgmehr in his court, and he had invited the surviving academicians of the Greco-Roman world, after Justinian had closed the last of the academies in the West. He had invited the last Greco-Roman academicians to the Sassanid court. So you had scientific research ongoing in places like the Academy of Gondeshapur in Sassanid Iran. But if we're really honest with ourselves, there's no evidence from the Sassanid period that shows a flourishing of science at the level that ultimately was achieved a couple of hundred years after the Islamic conquest. And the reason for that, I think, is that there was such ideological conformity, even amongst the intellectual elite of Sassanid Iran, that you didn't have the impetus for really novel revolutionary insights. And Islam acted as a catalyst to produce that by freeing the intellectual elite of Iran, freeing minds like the mind of Razi and Khwarazmi and Omar Khayyam, freeing them from an atmosphere of religious orthodoxy that existed in the late Sassanid period. Precisely because, whereas these men, many of whom were still called al-Majusi by the Muslim authors, in other words, the Magian, whereas these men would have taken Zoroastrian theology seriously, because it was sufficiently rationalistic, and they would have tried to harmonize their scientific research with a state religious orthodoxy, these men did not take Islam seriously. They thought it was ridiculous. You see this very clearly in the writings of Razi or Omar Khayyam, or even, like I said, Avicenna at the end of his life. So the fact that they didn't feel beholden to any religious theology, and that Zoroastrianism, the Zoroastrian orthodoxy, had already been shattered and sidelined, really, I think, created the social atmosphere for these bold advances in science and technological innovation. Iranian nationalists will often critique this period because there was no political unity of Iran at the time. But let's remember that the Italian Renaissance took place with the patronage of the Medicis at a time when there was no political unity in Italy. I mean, Italy consisted of a variety of independent city-states at that time. And yet no one would call into question the Italian Renaissance as perhaps the peak of Italy's culture. Even, I would say, perhaps more so than the Roman period, or at the very least the second peak of Italian history after the Roman period. So I don't think you necessarily need political unity for a cultural renaissance of that kind. And then, we should consider the fact that the Buyid dynasty had basically reunified most of what is Iran today and had even captured Baghdad. If it hadn't been for the Turkic invasion in 1050, invasion of masses of nomads from Siberia in 1050, I think under the Buyid patronage, we would have eventually seen a reunified Iran, an Iranian state that backed this project of a scientific and literary renaissance.
Now, I assume that the Ottomans in Anatolia and the Mughals in India chose Persian as their court language because of the respect they had for Persian culture and the fact that they must have recognized that their own language and their own culture was lacking in comparison.
Absolutely. Classical scholars of the Renaissance and early modern period in Europe always classified Persian as among the great classical languages of the world, together with Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. Mm-hmm. So Persian had that status of a lingua franca of culture and civilization that very few other languages have shared in history. French eventually developed that status, and until very recently was considered an international language by the United Nations and so forth. And so Persian is among those languages that achieved a level of global recognition as basically a vehicle for the promulgation of culture and learning.
Now, I have to say this. I think I had a good education growing up in the United States. I certainly studied world history. There was a lot of emphasis placed, obviously, on the Greeks, on the Chinese contributions. Very little on Persia. Now that I think about it, it feels like one of the reasons I'm so glad to have these interviews with you is you're filling in big gaps in my own education. And I suspect that that's probably true for most of our viewers who have a standard Western education that seems as if there was some effort to minimize or write Persia out of world history.
It's not a standard Western education. You wound up with that false impression because of the British educational system, which was adopted by the United States. If you look at the German educational system that produced Goethe and Schelling and Nietzsche, the German educational system very much recognized Iranian contributions to history, and it produced a whole series of thinkers who saw Iran as key in world history, people like Hegel. And the same is true to an extent in France as well. It's really the British who tried to erase Iran from world history, and they did it very deliberately. When the modern British educational curriculum was being developed during the height of British colonialism in the 1700s and the 1800s, the British were attempting to capture India from the Persians. So, as I mentioned, Nadir Shah had gone down into northern India. After the Mughals already had a Persianate culture in India for hundreds of years, Nadir Shah was politically integrating India back into the core of Iranian civilization. And so there was a very real chance in the 1700s that India would wind up to Iran what, let's say, Brazil was to Portugal for a while. That, just as there are more Portuguese speakers in Brazil than there are in Portugal itself, India would have become this vast Persian colonial territory. And the British wanted to take India from the Persians. So there was a very explicit colonial rivalry between the waning Iranian empire of the Safavids and the Afsharids and the rising British Empire. And part of any conflict like that is psychological warfare and, propagandistic writings of history. The British created Afghanistan as a wedge between Iran and northern India to be able to come in and establish the Raj and, secure their colonial control over India. And I think that colonial project, the British colonial project in particular, had a devastating effect on what had been the civilizational sphere of Iran. Because instead of people growing up reading Hafez in madrasas, in traditional schools, instead of people reading Hafez alongside of the Quran and memorizing his poetry and seeing the Quran through the lens of Hafez, which had been the case, they were uprooted from that Persian heritage and wound up gravitating toward really literalist, fundamentalist interpretations of Islam as the British divided and conquered what had been, parts of the Iranian civilizational sphere or the Persianate world. So I think the cultural uprooting that happened in the Islamic world had a lot to do with the British colonial project, and that is the colonial project responsible for writing Iran out of world history.
Well, when we think of a Renaissance, I know that you're of the opinion that the potential exists for a second Renaissance of a flourishing of Iranian culture.
Yeah, so we don't have the Scythians around anymore today, except for the small remnant in the nation of Ossetia. and we don't have the Sarmatians so much anymore, although the Croatians are also a relic of the Sarmatian people. But we do have still an internal differentiation of a variety of cultures in Iranian civilization that extend over a vast geographical sphere. So, for example, the Tajiks, not just in the nation of Tajikistan, but the Tajiks of Uzbekistan and the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in particular, and the Tajiks of northern Afghanistan are part of the Iranian civilization to this day. The Kurds in northern Iraq, in Syria, and in a large eastern quarter of Turkey are all a part of Iranian civilization. These are people who are ethnically and linguistically Iranian. They speak an Iranian language, and they've been a part of the Iranian civilizational sphere. So, there are whole parts of also even the Baluch in the part of Pakistan next to Iranian Baluchistan. The Baluch are ethnically and linguistically Iranian, and even the Pashtuns in southern Afghanistan. Their language, actually, the Pashtun language in southern Afghanistan, is the closest contemporary language to the Avestan language used by Zarathustra. So you have a vast geographical sphere of people who ethnically and linguistically are part of Iranian civilization. And I think there's a potential for a cultural renaissance across that entire sphere, as well as a cultural renaissance that would encompass the Shiite parts of the Arab world. Because Shiism has not just since the Safavid period, where it was institutionalized as a state religion, but even from the days of the first revolts against the caliphate, from the days of the revolt of Babak Khurramdin in Azerbaijan, from the days when the Order of Assassins led by Hassan Sabah was fighting against the Seljuk overlords of Iran. All the way from, the early Middle Ages, Shiaism has become integral to Iranian national identity. And so these parts of the Arab world that are Shiite can also, in a contemporary sense, be considered extensions of the Iranian civilizational sphere. And I think that a revitalization of Iranian civilization today would go a long way toward constructively transforming the Islamic world and transforming, Islamic values and the ethos of Muslims at a time when we're seeing a demographic shift on a planetary scale toward a Muslim majority by the end of the 21st century. So if you can imagine, a future where, instead of Salafists and Wahhabis controlling the spiritual heart of the Islamic world, you have the poetry of Hafez and Rumi being recited at the Kaaba in Mecca, and whirling dervishes dancing around the Kaaba stone in Mecca. I think that kind of a world where the sphere of Islamic civilization, as it's called today, has reclaimed its Iranian roots is a world that's going to be much more constructive and beneficial to humanity at large.
You seem to be suggesting that a revitalization of a Muslim world, a way to, in effect, integrate the Muslim world with global culture. And global culture, to me, these days is primarily economic. Actually, it's a business culture largely. That can be accomplished by an emphasis on the esoteric aspects of Islamic and Central Asian culture, as opposed to the more fundamentalist aspects of the Islamic religion.
I'm talking about an emphasis on the esoteric mysticism of Iranian civilization, which and also the Iranian genius in the sciences and technology, which is responsible for all of the glory of so-called Islamic civilization. So a renaissance of Iranian civilization at this period in history will fundamentally affect the destiny of the Islamic world as the Muslim population rises to a majority on a global scale. Samuel Huntington, a Harvard professor of political science, wrote a really influential work around the time of the, I think he wrote it slightly before the collapse of the Soviet Union, or anyway, around about that time, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. And he presented this theory of the world entering a post-national epoch where the major conflicts were no longer between nation states, they were between rival civilizations. And he develops this theory where you have, civilizational core states, like, say, the United States of America as the core state of Western civilization, holding it together through the NATO alliance. Or China as the core state of a Chinese civilization that includes, say, Taiwan, which is not yet politically integrated with China. Or Russia as the core state of an Orthodox civilization, right? And then you have the periphery of these civilizations, peripheral states. And he also describes what he calls lone states, like Japan, that has a strong culture but doesn't belong to any larger civilization. And then torn states, which are countries torn between two or more civilizations. Mm-hmm. And you might see India as an example of that, where you have a large Muslim population in northern India and a growing Muslim demographic in India, to the point where you have to wonder if in the future India is going to maintain its national unity, or whether it's going to be really in a more violent way torn between Islamic civilization and its Hindu cultural identity. So he develops this theory of civilizations, and he points to the fact that the only civilization today lacking a core is Islamic civilization. Islamic civilization has no identifiable core state. And this causes a serious problem in terms of geopolitics, because the core states of other civilizations, like, let's say, America or China or Russia, don't know who to negotiate with in the Islamic world. There's no recognized representative of the Islamic civilizational sphere. And I've argued in my new book, Iranian Leviathan, that if you look at the various countries that could step in and become the core state of Islamic civilization, quote unquote Islamic civilization, which I think ought to be transformed back into Iranian civilization, none of them are even close to rivaling Iran for that potential. So, you've got Iraq, which is a failed state, was always an artificial state. You've got Turkey, which is linguistically and geographically peripheral in order to be able to carry out that role today. Pakistan is militarily very strong, has a large population, has nuclear weapons, but again, because of its Urdu language and its geographical positioning, also because of its ongoing conflict with India, it's in no place to really assume leadership of the Islamic world. Malaysia and Indonesia are totally peripheral from a historical standpoint, despite their large populations and economic potential. The only state that I see as a potential rival to Iran is Egypt. Saudi Arabia has nowhere near the industrial base for it. Their entire economy is organized around an unsustainable petroleum resource, and they don't have the cultural base to act in that position of guidance and leadership either. Egypt could, but that would involve the takeover of a Muslim Brotherhood type Islamist state in Egypt that would think of Egypt not as a nation, but as a base of operations to organize a Sunni caliphate. And the formation of such a Sunni Orthodox caliphate is, I think, exactly the threat that ought to convince the other world powers and, the elites of other civilizations to back the rise of Iran as the core state of so-called Islamic civilization, and the eventual transformation of an Islamic civilizational sphere back into an Iranian civilizational sphere that experiences an Iranian Renaissance that would be to the benefit of all of humanity.
Well, Jason, you have a vision.
I do.
And as I understand this vision, potentially it could result in a positive outlook for world peace in general.
It could. And, I think key to that is stability and internal transformation inside Iran. So Iran definitely needs a cultural revolution. The idea of an Iranian Renaissance is the idea of a cultural revolution. That has to take place. And in fact, it is happening right now at a grassroots level. On the other hand, I think it's very important that an attempt not be made to excise Islam from Iran's civilizational history, to attempt to lobotomize Iranian civilization, and rewind the clock 1400 years to a period before the Islamic conquest is, I think, going to leave you with an internally conflicted, shattered nation divided against itself and totally isolated from surrounding Islamic countries, rather than an Iran that experiences a cultural rebirth by rerouting itself in its pre-Islamic culture, and at the same time, remaining connected to all of the spiritual, artistic, and scientific developments in the Islamic period so that it can play a leadership role throughout the Islamic world.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's only fair to mention that we're conducting this interview at a time when war between the United States and Iran is a possibility. And in fact, only, I think, a few weeks ago, or maybe even less, a few days ago, we nearly were at that point. I'm pretty sure that you think that's a very unwise thing for America or other Western nations or countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to provoke war.
Not only do I think it's unwise, I think that the casus belli, the reason that is being cited for the application of all this pressure on Iran by Western powers is totally unjustifiable. The main reason that the United States and its allies are giving for all of these bullying tactics that they're employing against the regime in Iran has nothing to do, by the way, with human rights, because, the United States is an ally of Saudi Arabia, which is the greatest violator of human rights probably on the planet. It has to do with Iran's regional influence, particularly in the Shiite Arab countries. And I see that as a very beneficial thing. So going back to the discussion we were just having about, Iran remaining connected to all of the cultural developments that took place in the Islamic period, the Italian Renaissance did not restore Greco-Roman paganism. The Italian Renaissance that was patroned by the Medicis was completely compatible with the power of the Vatican and, really advanced in league with the Vatican. So I don't see why there can't be an Iranian Renaissance that reclaims very inspiring elements of Iran's pre-Islamic culture, and at the same time, the Iranian state that is backing this project of a cultural revival could use the Shiite theological establishment as a kind of Vatican that influences a wider Shiite and Muslim world, the way that the Vatican in Italy today has plays a role of guidance throughout the entire Roman Catholic world, particularly in Latin America. So I think that the Shiite theological establishment has a very constructive role to play in guiding at least the parts of the Arab Muslim world that are Shiite, and that would be incomparably that would be, a much better scenario than allowing the rise of Salafism and Wahhabism and these really narrow legalistic Sunni schools of thought to dominate those countries. Mm-hmm. So, to me, the West is making a grave mistake in not welcoming the increasing influence of a Shiite tradition that includes very enlightened esoteric mysticism.
Jason Reza Jorjani, once again, not only an informative interview, but one with visionary potential.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much. And thank you for being with us.